Welcome to the May edition of the Midwest and Great Plains Climate and Drought Outlook. Dennis Toddy, from the director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub up in Ames, Iowa, will provide an overview of the recent past climate and future outlook for us, as well as some of the impacts that we're seeing across the region as it pertains to fire weather, agricultural impacts, and other issues, including flooding and drought. So, anyway, without any further ado, Dennis, why don't you take over? And thank you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Yeah, we have drought, famine, pestilence, all kinds of great things to talk about this month. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate that. It's a lovely day here in Ames. We have transitioned finally from our cold April into May, and things have shifted around, and that's changed a lot of what's going on around us. We'll talk about that more as we go along. This is actually one of my favorite days of the month, getting a chance to do this and getting to talk to people and talking with people over the last couple of weeks about what's going on around the region. Always an enjoyable time. So thanks to Pete, excuse me. Thanks to Pete Boulay for the Minnesota Climate Office sharing this picture from the University of Minnesota campus. Indeed, convinced that Minnesota is transitioning here too. Just a reminder of some of our general information again. Collaboration among a number of different entities, federal and state throughout the region. Actually, an excellent, wonderful collaboration of a bunch of good people. Our next webinar will be June 21st. Aaron Wilson from the Ohio State Climate Office and Ohio State Extension will be leading that one. Doug and I are already talking about things we need to have him talk about next month, so plenty of things to talk about there. Again, these are available soon afterwards. We can share with people once they are created and posted there. So our agenda, being an ag-related hub, we share a picture of planting going on in northeastern South Dakota from Laura Edwards with the State Climate Office and South Dakota Extension. So we're going to talk about current conditions, some of our impact issues, a wide variety of impact issues as usual, lots of interesting things to talk about. And then we'll talk about some of our outlooks, transitioning La Nina, possibly to El Nino, and then what the outlooks are saying for planting, the rest of planting, and our summer. So first, review of current conditions, April temperature recap. Everybody remembers April. Everybody's probably happy to forget about April at this point. A very remarkable month throughout the middle part of the country and actually throughout most of the eastern 2/3 of the country. You see the ranking here for the month out of 124 years of data, coming in top 10 throughout the middle third-ish of the country there. The big winners were Wisconsin and Iowa coming in at #1. Iowa beating out the record that everybody remembers from 1907, April of 1907, and then a number of top 5s surrounding us there just because of the overall cool conditions throughout the month. Contrast with areas just to our west that were not on the cool side as you look over into Wyoming and Colorado, which were not nearly as cool and actually slightly on the warmer side of average. If we contrast that with precipitation, you get a whole different view on this. Not too unexpected with the repeated cold outbreaks we had coming from Canada. Canadian air doesn't bring a lot of moisture along with it. Therefore, we had some very dry conditions. The eastern edge of our area, Ohio, and then onto the eastern seaboard had the light greens, again, 124 years of record, were falling in the above average category. But you see, again, the middle section of our region here falling in top, a few hitting top 10, Missouri and Kansas, top 10 driest Aprils, and then some other ones, Iowa the 13th and Minnesota the 14th. Actually, the cold air was probably beneficial given the amount of dryness. We would have had some additional issues from dryness if we had been warm at all during the same time period. Then I guess with contrast also looking at Montana, which was on the fairly wet side, 106th when we're going to talk a little bit more about the situation out in the Rockies there. If we look back January through April, up on the left-hand side, temperatures for January through April in the rankings, again, overall on the cold side, not as extreme as April was. Probably a little bit La Nina related and a couple other issues added to that. But again, we have a real sharp contrast going from cold in the plains to warm in the mountains. You see Colorado actually ending up would be a top 15 warmest, depending on reversing the counting there, ending up at a number 113. The eastern part of our area was kind of middle of the road in the way of temperatures. If we look at precipitation on the lower right-hand side, you see most of the Ohio Valley, particularly driven earlier on in the winter where they had some overall wet conditions. Ohio coming in top 15 wettest, just outside our area. West Virginia being very, very, very wet. But then that contrasts with our far north, Minnesota and North Dakota, for the first part of the year, January through April, coming in top 20 and 31. And then Kansas still sitting out there with a top 10 driest, and that's presetting some conditions we're going to talk about here as we go along on the way of dryness. Then we need to contrast that with what's happened over the last 30 days, because the shift over the last and some things over the last 30 days have continued to impact some things related to agriculture and some other issues. Upper left-hand side, we have total precipitation over the last 30 days, ending yesterday. You see, the only areas that have had much significant precipitation mainly go from southern Minnesota over to southern Wisconsin and parts of Michigan and a little bit out in Colorado. The lower right-hand side shows how we are at percent of normal, and you see a few spots pop up out in the plains because normals are not quite as high, so the percent of normal is in some cases 150% of average. We did get comments from Becky Bollinger at the Colorado Climate Office about northeastern Colorado being wet. And we've talked a little bit about Montana being wet in places. We've got a couple images to show you along there. And then the wet area, southeast South Dakota on over to Wisconsin and Michigan, has been impacting agricultural issues there. This area has really slowed in the way of planting progress because soils are simply too wet throughout most of this area to be able to do much with. And we've not had a long enough period of heat to be able to dry those out. So all the reports out of Michigan, southern Minnesota, southeast South Dakota, and about the northern 3 tiers of counties in Iowa say things are really sitting from an agricultural perspective. You see further south, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, even parts of Ohio, last 30 days less than half of average. And then up in North Dakota, up into Minnesota, even some areas that are 50% or less than 25% of average during that time period. So we have had some very dry conditions over that last over the last part here. Again, the contrast, a really interesting point to contrast this of what happened in April versus what is happening so far in May. From Mike Timlin here at the Midwest Regional Climate Center. The top is the temperature departure from average or mean for the month of April. Cold throughout the whole area as we've shown, but as much as 12 degrees Fahrenheit below average for a month. That is an astounding number compared to average, even during the transition seasons, which are much more variable. But you contrast that with what has happened over the first 16 days of May. The whole region is warm, and we have places that are as much as 10 degrees above average for this contrasting period. So I've heard the analogy the last couple days twice with there was a switch flipped, and we've gone from cold to warm and made a very, very rapid transition, which is, again, having a number of impacts in the agricultural sector. Highlighting this warm area, again, is also something that came up during various discussions about an area that has been kind of a stationary boundary throughout several times in the last few weeks, where we've had very warm conditions down in Missouri, southern Illinois, Indiana, and less warm conditions up, around the I-80 area or just a little bit south of there, where you've had a very sharp contrast in warmth. You see the whole area is warm again. This is last 2 weeks and a different time period, but you can see the contrast in warmth that has occurred there, and it's kind of hung up there several times. Okay, Transitioning some other things here, 7-day average stream flow. The areas, some of the areas we've talked about in dryness and some of the warmth is starting to affect some of the stream flows right now, positive and negative. The area from eastern Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, even parts of Ohio now, stream flows are coming in, in some cases in the less than the 10th percentile, or even lower than that over in parts of Kansas and Nebraska. That's getting quite low. Some of these other areas that are a little bit low, it's a reminder that this time of year stream flows typically are higher coming out of the winter as there's still some runoff period. So stream flows overall means there's still water there, but they are running below average overall. Compared that area with the area of wetness, you see it's running above the 90th percentile, in some cases the highest on record for that time period. And also worth pointing out, parts of Colorado, Wyoming are high, and then very much up northern Wyoming and Montana. But this is a different situation with the snow melt in that area. They are high stream flows, but we're doing a quick job on the snow out there, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit also. Soil moisture wise, a graphic from NOAA also. The same story we're getting at here. Drier, this Kansas to Illinois area, and drier to the north. That band where the precipitation hit has been wetter up in Wyoming and Montana. A different graphic that I don't think we have shown before. I can't remember if anyone has done it before. It's a relatively new one called the EDDI. It's the Evaporative Demand Index, and it's an idea that it tries to assess not only when we talk about lack of precipitation, we know that's a drought issue, but then how much has there been the atmospheric demand? Has there been have there been other things that are driving removal of water from the surface more readily? And those things would include, lower relative humidities, more wind, more sunny skies, or higher solar radiation. Those go into a component what we call evapotranspiration and estimating evapotranspiration. This product estimates how much of that, how much atmospheric demand is being put on that surface, and then the redder the area is, it's related to what our drought conditions would be like. So that same area that we've been pointing out, Kansas to Missouri and parts of southern Iowa, relatively high, and Missouri, southeastern Iowa, quite high, high atmospheric demand. So what moisture is available on that surface is being evaporated and removed more readily. That area farther to the north, much less atmospheric demand because of somewhat cooler conditions and higher relative humidities there. So this is one we probably should keep an eye on as we go along, because it's another indicator of the developing drought conditions, which we'll talk about more here in just a minute. Well, and actually, Dennis, we'll talk. Yes.
Dennis, can I just go back to that one real quick?
Yeah.
I think, and I may have this wrong, but I think this is the way it goes. This is the 1 month EDDI, we'll call it. And it's really just looking at the last month. It doesn't really go back till October 1st and try to look at that. It looks for sort of, if you will, real-time dry issues, such that we can pick them up earlier. So in case there's a sort of a flash drought going on, in which high temperatures, a lot of wind, something like that, this tool is very useful in picking those types of situations out. That's all.
The website, you can pick and choose and look at it over a longer period of time if you choose to do that. I looked at the 1 month because of the more rapidly developing conditions here, and you can zoom it down, I think, even into weeks periods if you want to. So we didn't want to belabor too many of those, but if you're interested, go ahead and check that out. It is a good graphic to pick up on some of these, as Doug mentioned, some of the shorter term issues. Okay, where we're sitting from a U.S. Drought Monitor standpoint over our region particularly, just released this morning, the new one. What has happened there? Okay. Okay, there we go, got it back now. We have still some carryover issues up in the Dakotas from the last 1 to 2 years, some D1, a little bit of D2 up along the Canadian border. There has been expansion this week into particularly Minnesota and northern Wisconsin of the D0 areas, recognizing some of the dryness there. Southern part of our region, combination of dryness and warmth in Colorado has pushed some areas all the way into D4, the far southwest part of the state, and parts of D4 in the southwestern Kansas also. Much of Kansas is in some level of drought, only small areas that are in D0 or D not or D nada. And that carries over into northern Missouri, southern Iowa, where we, and especially southern Iowa, we have some last 2 years deficits from long-term issues related there, and some D0 carrying over in Illinois, recognizing some of the developing dryness there. We'll talk about what's happening in the way of precipitation as we go along here. Transitioning to some of the yes.
And Dennis, just to remind folks, D0 doesn't mean you're in drought. It means that you're in the condition is such that you're right, like pre-drought, if you will. It's dry.
Yes, D0 is not considered a drought category. It is a transition in or a transition out of, and used to recognize, hey, it's dry conditions. If there is impact that is being reported, then we should be in a drought, at least a D1 level of some kind. If that doesn't line up, try to contact one of us. We can get people in contact locally and share that with the Drought Monitor off on a week-by-week basis. Local impacts are part of what goes into the development of the U.S. Drought Monitor. Okay, transitioning to some of the records. Lots of record things to talk about. These are again from Midwest Regional Climate Center for the month of April. On the lower right, on the right-hand side, monthly low temperatures, no question there. Records for the month. For coldest temperatures. On the left-hand side, oddly enough, snowfall records for the month. I didn't include a graphic about total snowfalls. We could have very readily. We had a couple events that dropped up to or over 20 inches of snowfall up into Wisconsin in some cases. I believe Mike Timlin shared this morning on another webinar that Appleton, Wisconsin had their highest snowfall ever. About 24 inches or something like that. So lots of record monthly snowfall. Interestingly enough, didn't set many records in the way, and I don't think we'd set any records in the way of precipitation because it was mainly snowfall and not a lot of as much liquid involved there. Even some record snowfall areas in this region down here. In contrast, we've flipped as we've gone to, we talked about in May already. Upper left-hand side is the first week of May. Lower right-hand side is the second week of May. These are record temperatures, I believe, for either weeks or daily temperatures. But we've made a transition and we've gone from record lows to record highs already. We've talked about already. And a little bit, the other one, though, maybe is not from a record standpoint. The climatologies aren't as good, but certainly something we've noted has been a lack of severe weather. Oklahoma was close to or set a record, and that's outside of our area, for the latest first tornado that they had. Up in the left-hand side is, this is from the Storm Prediction Center, preliminary data. These are confirmed tornado reports since the beginning of the year. You see some pockets of them that have occurred now, but we are well into the middle of the severe weather season and typically would have seen more than this. All severe weather reports, including wind, tornadoes, and hail, are on the lower right-hand side, so it looks like more. Parts of Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois, not too many reports there. There's just been a kind of a dearth of severe weather. The cold temperatures back in April, again, slowed the start of the severe weather season just because we had a lack of moisture and a lack of heat to set off with the instability. I joked on our call yesterday, it's very hard to produce convection when you've got 30-degree temperatures. It just doesn't happen very much. So severe weather is starting to kick up now, but again, still been somewhat limited. Okay, near and dear to my heart, agricultural impacts. Some of we've talked a bit about them already. Where we are in the way of soil temperatures are about a 50-degree soil temperature is typically where we want to see for doing things with corn, for development of corn, maybe closer to 60 for soybeans. And you can see that is mainly these are, the southern parts of the Corn Belt, a little ways north of I-80 and further south, the warmest areas. Further north, we've got 50-degree temperatures, but not quite as warm up in those regions, and still some areas up in Minnesota and Wisconsin don't have as many observations up there, but not quite as warm in those regions. NAS topsoil moisture, we've talked a little bit about this already. Basically, the states up in the near the Great Lakes and adjacent, the topsoil reports are just a few percent of saying topsoil moisture is short. As we get down into Missouri, Kansas, and parts of North Dakota, topsoil moisture being short the numbers are higher than expected for this time of the year. Okay, quiz time. How many, for those of you that are more interested in this, from last week's corn and soybean crop progress, are we ahead or behind, or it depends, or don't care? We don't have a way of surveying this right now, but you can pick and choose. The actual correct answers, there's two correct answers. Amazingly enough, given how slow we were starting this year, corn and soybean planting is ahead of average at this point, but it also depends on where you are. We'll touch on that here in these next few slides. These are shared by Brad Rippey from USDA in DC, the Office of the Chief Economist, and the World Agricultural Outlook Board. Ones that are in green are ahead of average, and then the darker into the tans and oranges are behind average. So we're looking at corn here, upper left-hand side planted, well above average, ahead of planting from Missouri over into even over in Ohio. Some places, Indiana and Illinois, are 20 and 21% ahead of average. In contrast, we have Minnesota 25% behind. South Dakota is still 40% behind planting. These are not as big a corn areas, but they still are big corn production areas. So we're slow there because of the wetness and cool going on. Corn progress, about how much has emerged, very similar to what we saw before that. And again, just slightly ahead, but still 1% above, really due to the recent drying conditions. Dry soils warm up more quickly. They respond to temperature more quickly. So temperatures popped up, they were dry, conditions moved along very quickly. Further north, the wetter soils and just temperatures have not warmed up quite enough. Progress has not been able to be made. Soybeans, a very similar situation, but even more so. Illinois, 42% ahead of average. These are astounding numbers. 34% ahead in Indiana, and some other ones making good progress, while we're 26% behind up in Minnesota. Percent emerged is, again, that's fairly early. Soybeans are planted after corn typically, so we're making pretty good progress in that area. Other various ag issues reported from Nebraska. Cover crops are becoming a bigger thing. We're having some crop termination issues because the cold temperatures, the cover crops didn't start developing soon enough. Also reporting several different places, various times, from 1.5 weeks to maybe 2-3 weeks behind because of the cold. If you had, some people have livestock, they keep them in feedlots and turn them out to pasture. The pastures are slow developing because of the cold temperatures, so they're having to hold them back and not let them out on pasture. That's a little bit higher feed cost for them. Lots of crop insurance discussions. Prevented plant, basically prevent plant is, am I going to be able to get these in and ahead of time, and then being able to get if you have that rider, you can get a payment. Dry areas in Nebraska, lots of additional tillage, which is not good and not recommended. A couple comments in Michigan and Indiana about some fruit tree damage this winter. The warm fall temperatures into somewhat late, and then some very cold temperatures this winter didn't kill trees, but did damage buds this year, seemed to be the common indicator. Another ag-related issue from Nebraska people may have heard about, some of the excess tillage or some tillage period combined with very dry conditions and windy conditions caused dust blowing over I-80, led to multi-car pileups. You see a lot of that on the upper left-hand side. And then there were at least one, maybe multiple fatalities related to this. This is really impressive to see, and this is Dust Bowl kind of like the kind of thing we don't like to see in the way of soil management practices. Looking at water and some snow issues now, transitioning. Looking out further to the west, what's happening in the way of snowpack. You can really greatly see the difference in where you are in the mountains, in the way of the Rockies. Further north, these are NRCS snow water equivalents of how they are compared to average. The greens and blues are again above average. ranging from around average in southern Montana to northwestern Wyoming, up to still places that are as much as double their average snow water equivalent in these regions. As you look further west and further south, much lower snow water contents in these areas. And the warm temperatures are making quick transitions. As we see that with this graphic from, thanks to Kevin Grody from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. What this shows is this is the Missouri River above Fort Peck, and then Fort Peck to Garrison. Basically, this is the Missouri River, and on the right-hand side, this is, I believe, the Yellowstone River, of how much mountain snowpack there is. Both of these areas had well above average snowpacks, 30 to 40% above the peak, depending on where you are. The peak occurs about around April 1 or something like that, or middle of April. But you can see the very rapid transition in both of these, where that snow melt has started to melt off very quickly and go down because of the warm temperatures. So even though there was a lot of snowpack, it's making its way downward into the Missouri River system very quickly. Now, there might be people concerned about that because of some other flood year issues. The Corps is quite confident they have enough storage. And then the inflows further down, I don't have any graphic on this, but inflows into the Missouri River system further down are actually quite low. So they're actually having to release more water than they would want to at the lower part of the reservoir system to keep flows up appropriately on the lower part of the Missouri River. Just threw in the Platte River system, North Platte and South Platte. Both of those were not nearly as flush with snow this year, but they are both showing that quick melt off at the end, and showed in some of the stream flow conditions that we saw earlier. There are some flooding issues related to this. The upper left-hand one is from Clark's Fork. Doug did remind me that is on the other side of the divide, part of Montana, but not something we cover, some of the flooding issues. On our side of the Missouri River, despite the quick runoff, there's not been too many issues related to that. We are getting some flooding working its way downstream on the Mississippi River, downstream from those wet areas in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin. As those all flowed in the Missouri, it's gradually working its way downstream. I don't know if we've quite reached peak yet or starting to work our way down. I'm not sure if Ray Wolf is on. He can maybe comment on that. Another interesting thing with the late cold temperatures is lake ice out. These are the ice out dates from Minnesota on the upper left-hand side. They have a very unique data set for a number of their lakes. The Citizen Science reports on when ice goes out of the lake. Most of them were in April, and some even in early May. Before I think Pete Boyce said the last one had finally gone out. Some of these were record late. Even Iowa doesn't have the same data set, but the Iowa Great Lakes in the northwest part of the state, they also had a data set going back to the early 20th century. It was the latest ice out in that region. A little bit of a look at the Great Lakes, Lake Superior. There still is ice in Lake Superior. This is from the National Weather Service in Marquette, Michigan. It is breaking up, but there still is, there's still some ice flows out in Lake Michigan. You can see these from May 12th, these pictures from May 12th up in that area. Jumping to fire pretty quickly. Fire has not been as huge an issue yet, but there still are some issues out there. There are some current issues farther north, up in mainly northern Minnesota, maybe a little bit of Wisconsin, partially because of dryness, partially because they simply have not greened up there. So there's lots of dry fuels that are able to be burned because things have not greened up. As we look ahead for the potential for wildland fire, NIFC, the Interagency Fire Group, their predictive services, looks ahead at what the fire potential is. Up in the upper left-hand side in June, below normal up in South Dakota into northern Wyoming because of some wetter conditions there. Parts of Colorado, we've noted some dryness down there. They are above average or above normal wildfire potential. If we jump to July, things kind of shift. Colorado goes out of the wildfire area, South Dakota moves out, and then up into Montana becomes above normal into that region. Related to some of the outlooks going on. Okay, speaking of the outlooks, we'll jump along to the outlooks here with one picture from Montana. Nice to see wetland areas in Montana that have water in them. Okay, talk a little about La Nina, El Nino status, and then 7-day outlook, 8 to 14-day outlook, and on through into the summer and growing season about what we can say going on. Just a couple slides talking about the situation going on with El Nino, or La Nina in this case. We are officially out of a La Nina. The area where we look at is along the equatorial Pacific. We've got a graphic here with a few weeks showing that area in blue along the equatorial Pacific becoming weaker as sea surface temperatures have warmed. That cold pool has gone away, so that is another indicator of weakening La Nina. Below the surface, which we show another graphic here, below the surface, the blue area is the shrinking cold pool. Below the surface, we have some warmer waters heading toward it that is shrinking the cold pool, and we'll watch how quickly that is able to transition us to El Nino. We are not expecting a quick transition to El Nino, but it is being discussed and watched about as we go into the fall or winter. And that's basically what this graphic is talking about. What are the probabilities again of, in blue is La Nina, probability of El Nino is in red, and the probability of being neutral is in gray. And then for each one of these 3-month periods, the 3 bars add up to 100%. 100%
Hey,
probability.
Dennis.
Yes.
Hey, Dennis, explain those 3-month periods at the bottom so people have an idea of what you're talking about.
3-month periods we're looking at are April, May. These are overlapping here, so it's April, May, June, July, June, July, August. So you see the red bar, the probability of El Nino increases till we get to, say, October, November, December, where it is the more likely event as we get to late fall, early winter, and then we push about a 50%, just less than a 50% probability of El Nino occurring this winter. There's still a lot to happen in between there, and so don't read too much into this, but that's the direction we're heading right now. So it's something we'll keep an eye on and talk about in further outlooks. Okay, looking at what we're looking at for the near term now and closer to us. 7-day forecast precipitation. There are several events likely to occur in more of our plains area, giving parts of South Dakota, Nebraska, chances for several inches of precipitation. Parts of these areas, that's not a bad thing. Parts of these areas in South Dakota or in the Minnesota, not as good a thing because those areas still are delayed in the way of planting. More of the focus regionally nationally will be in the southeast because of some projected tropical activity as June 1 starts the hurricane season. We also have some pockets of some possible higher precipitation closer to the Ohio Valley. If we jump ahead now to the 8 to 14-day outlook, we're getting towards the last part of May here. Temperature-wise, high probability that we continue to be warmer than average. This probability puts us up 60% probability. That's not as big as some we've seen, but there's a pretty good probability we stay warmer than average. For the areas that are wetter, this will help to dry them out. For the areas that are drier, this will add to some of the problems. So kind of a mixed bag. Also, crops that are starting to grow, this will add some heat to them to help push along their growth. From a precipitation standpoint, slightly increased chance of precipitation from the northern plains down towards the Ohio Valley. Not a big above average chance, but somewhat there. Unfortunately, our southern areas down into Kansas and connecting to Oklahoma, the areas that are quite dry on the U.S. Drought Monitor, below average chances for precipitation in that area. Jumping to June now, these again just released this morning. June, temperature-wise, most of the country has at least a slightly increased chance of above average temperatures. Part of our region, Iowa, Missouri, on down to the south and west, has a higher probability of that, likely due to the overall drier conditions there at this time of year. If you are dry, you tend to be warmer than average, and if you are wet, you tend to be cooler than average. Since we are dry down there, I think that's more likely to connect that to warmer than average temperatures, along with overall trend. Without El Nino or La Nina right now, we have to use other indicators in the outlooks, and in this case, it is trend and probably soil moisture. Precipitation-wise, almost all of our area is an EC, equal chances. Parts of Wyoming, Montana, maybe a slightly drier chance, and then far eastern area along the Ohio Valley, a slightly increased chance of precipitation. Now an interesting one, June through August time period, temperature-wise throughout a good portion of our region is EC equal chances. This is largely based on overall trend, where this is a commonly known warming hole in the middle of summer, that the temperature trend is not, we've not seen increases in as much of increases in temperatures in this area. Our edge areas, Ohio Valley, a slight chance of being warmer, and out in the southern plains and far west, we have, again, also chances of being warmer. The main part of our region, equal chances for below or above average temperatures. Interestingly enough, there's this area of wetter than average over most of the eastern part of our region. Again, it's a fairly small probability, but exists there. And so we'll have to keep an eye on this, given the current developing dryness in parts of Missouri, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, even parts of Ohio. This would help to counteract that. If this does not pan out, we could have some other issues developing as we're going along. We're going to continue watching those quite readily. Jump ahead one set of months. Now we go July, August, September. You'll notice that wet area in the east disappears, and we go to only part of Kentucky and Ohio having slightly above average chances for precip. And then our far western area, as the monsoon kicks in. This is the time of year for monsoon with increased probabilities for precipitation there. Temperature-wise, a very similar kind of outlook as we saw for June, July, August. So it's an interesting contrast, especially in the way of precipitation, that we'll have to keep an eye on to see what is able to verify here. And then we throw on the drought outlook. The drought outlook from a seasonal standpoint is, again, a tough thing to try to assess. Basically, what is projected here, parts of Iowa, Minnesota, and then parts of Kansas, either drought, the greenish, the olive color, drought removal is likely, and then the little bit lighter color remains but improves. This is based on climatology for this time of year. This is a higher precipitation time of year, so that is what is being saying has the most likelihood of improving the situation here. Tough to see what's going to happen here, but that's what's being talked about. Up in the northern plains, drought persisting is more likely, and then maybe a little bit of removal in South Dakota. So again, this is from now through the end of August, so it's a tougher overall call to be able to verify that. Okay, summary conditions. Very cold April, set lots of records, cold and snow. Not precipitation records we talked about because of the overall lack of total moisture that was in the snowfall. Big snowfall amounts. We had a station in Iowa that had 37 inches for the month. I think it was a top 10 month overall for any month. Some amazing amounts of snowfall there. Very quickly flipped at the end of the month into May, very warm conditions that impacted snowmelt. It's helped out to impact agriculture after the slow start to the cropping season. Cold, the persistent cold also avoided many crop issues for perennials. They stayed dormant. There were, for the extreme cold, a little bit of damage, but not widespread. So overall, it's been pretty good. We talked about less severe weather. And then we have drought issues, from Kansas all the way up to D4 in parts of Colorado. But then as we got over to Missouri and Iowa, less of those, still some going in the Dakotas, but they are expanding right now because of near-term dryness. Some near-term precipitation probably should help alleviate that. But again, convective season precipitation is a little bit finicky to deal with. La Nina is no longer. CPC is officially saying the La Nina is done. So now we are in between phases, or the jokingly called La Nada, and we'll start watching about how quickly we can transition, or if there's any influences look El Nino-ish like as we look towards the fall and winter. That impacts the outlooks. So they fall back on trend and some computer models and soil moisture, and we talked a little bit as being some of the indicators in those. Warmer likely for the whole region June. with then a large EC, equal chances in summer, but the edges of the area we deal with have a better chance of being warmer throughout the whole summer. June has wetter chances to the east with decreasing coverage into summer. That is, again, an interesting feature we'll have to keep an eye on. No specific, because there's no specific drying or showing in the outlooks, but we will need to monitor, for changes because convective season precipitation is a very difficult thing to assess overall. And I didn't talk about this in the June outlook. Even if you have near average precipitation in June, but you have warmer than average temperatures, that can still add up to some drying issues because warmer temperatures will increase the amount of that evaporative demand that we talked a little bit about that can show some of those issues. So again, number of different websites of our partners and where you can find additional information. And this is who we are. So we got through a lot there, and I think we still have time for some questions.
Yeah, and I apologize for not mentioning that earlier on, Dennis. First of all, thank you very much for doing the presentation this month. What I should have said was, hey, if anything occurs to you as we went along through this webinar, go ahead and use, there's a question form, if you will, in the webinar. You can write out questions as you think of them, and either I can reply to them as we go, or we can deal with them at the end. So, if anything is occurring to you, or if you have any questions about any particular area or impacts or outlooks that we just talked about, feel free to type them in there. If you raise your hand or put a question mark, I see one from Patrick. You know what, Patrick? I'm just going to turn your speaker on, and maybe you can either comment or make. Whoa! Okay. I'm going to shut you off, Patrick, and just go to the, I'm getting some weird feedback there. I'm going to go to your questions that you've written in. There's a question about, Dennis, about the Kansas wheat harvest, and maybe talk a little bit more about wheat generally, especially in the Southern Plains, Kansas South.
Correct.
I know you know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, didn't dwell on that too much, but I mean, the dryness area that we showed, and I didn't show the whole U.S. Drought Monitor, some of the worst areas of the U.S. Drought Monitor are right over the winter wheat regions. So we, some of the area was dry last fall when winter wheat was planted. So that, that limits some establishment. We had some cold there, which did some additional damage to winter wheat. And then, then we have these drying conditions now, which is again over much of the winter wheat areas. We also have winter wheat areas up in South Dakota. They haven't hit quite as badly, but they've struggled a bit too. I don't have the numbers quickly at hand. I'm trying to remember what they were, but overall the winter wheat area has been hit pretty badly, and the harvest projections are lowest. I won't even estimate what it was, lowest that has been in some time because of the overall damage done to the the widespread damage to the winter wheat crop. And then you could counteract that with, there's different uses for different kinds of wheat. Spring wheat, okay, maybe it's not as bad an area, but we were delayed getting planted in spring wheat. I didn't show that graphic, but we're well behind getting spring wheat planted, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with spring wheat.
Okay, thank you. All right. Bryce had a comment about South Dakota planting deficit, just saying it might be a little bit questionable based on what he has heard. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dennis, or
not. I can't say specifically. I know that there's been rapid, there's been pretty rapid transition to more being done. There could be, a little bit of emphasis in the southeast part of the state because of delays in the southeast part could be impacting it also. I would expect that number to pick up again next week.
Okay, back to the wheat real quick here. I'm trying to finish that off. Kansas wheat crop is expected to be the lowest since 1989, according to Bryce Anderson. And Brad Rippey has chimed in and said that winter wheat abandonment is at a record high 53% in Oklahoma and 66% in Texas. And 51% of Kansas wheat is in poor to very poor condition. Okay.
And just to explain for you what that is you plant winter wheat in the fall, and then it overwinters and then starts to grow in the springtime. And when we're talking about winter wheat abandonment, they're not even going to do anything with it. I don't know if you can get to a point of planting something else or planting a cover crop, but they're not even going to try to harvest it because it's a pointless exercise. So there'll be some kind of crop insurance settlement, and that will be done with.
Okay, another question about April. The first half of April temperatures were record cold, record cold, thus unprecedented. Did this year set a new record and exceed the 1920 record cold year? And Kevin, I would say it depends on where you are. It was either darn close or did set records in certain states. So I don't know how to completely. Dennis, could you go back to your fifth slide or sixth slide where it shows temperature for April? But that's for the whole month. So yeah, if you break it down into 15 days, I'm sure that you would have a lot more records.
Are you seeing that?
Yeah. So if you broke it down in the first 15 days or even 18 days, I'll bet you'd see a lot more ones and on the map. In other words, record.
Actually, definitely. You might not, because there were a few days that were warm-ish in the first 15 days, and then we got into that middle of the month, third week, where it got really cold again, which climatology would be much warmer. So the first 15 days might not show up as much as you expect it to, but yeah.
All right. I'm concerned about revisiting 2012 situation in terms of dryness. I think, and this is from Bryce, across, if people remember 2012, it really was, if you sort of centered across the center of the country, to be honest, across the Midwest and West, Nebraska, Wyoming even had their driest summers on record. So, Dennis, I'm not sure how to address the concern about that. It's interesting because 2012 was so dry, and I think, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong on this, but the mountain snowpacks weren't as high either. This year we have, pretty good snowpack northern Rockies, and so thus the main stem has a lot of water in it. But areas sort of, as Dennis alluded to, beyond Montana are relatively dry. Wyoming's fairly wet, but places downstream have been relatively dry.
And I know that there is, when you get this initial dryness early on, there's always comparison to some of those big years. One big difference we've had already we probably had some dryness, maybe semi-similar back in well, I won't say that. The thing you have to remember, back in 2012, we started early. We were very warm in March, and we that carried on. We were not as nearly as warm in March, and then we were quite cool in April. So there are people who recognize that has kept the situation from getting worse very, very quickly. So that's a change we're seeing already. Right now, the indicators are that we're going to continue to get precipitation, except probably southern areas I'm a little bit more concerned about, and maybe parts of that drying area, and from Missouri over to Indiana. But the June, July, August outlook has above average chances for precipitation there. So I'm not as I feel comfortable saying there will probably be some drought areas in the Corn Belt this summer. Right now, we just can't identify what those are, and the indicators are not of a widespread problem yet.
Yeah, I'd say that the models and such haven't really given us a lot, and often they don't this time of year in terms of long-term drought prediction. And so I would be I'd be careful using not only the outlooks, but I'd be careful using the drought outlook as well. because we are somewhat challenged, if you will, this time of year, especially in terms of precipitation. So,
and if Doug and I were better prognosticators, we'd be off making a lot more money someplace else.
no, I probably wouldn't be, but anyway, hey, we had a good question from Jim Penaz, and his question was, what's the period of record for the Minnesota ice out slide? Some of those go way, way back, right?
Yeah. I don't remember the numbers, but yeah, some of those probably go back to the early 20th century also. So you're not talking even 30 or 50 years. You're talking probably closer to a century in a number of those cases. So it's not, this is not an insignificant issue.
And I got a question about whether this, whoops, I'm getting an echo, Dennis. Can you shut me off somewhere or turn me down? Thanks. Hey, will the slides be available after the presentation? And yeah, I put a, still hear that. I put a link there for the webinars if someone wants to hear the recording or get the PDF file. Okay, another question from Bryce about irrigation. Do you think that irrigation demand will be higher this year?
We did have some discussion about that, about irrigation and supply. Certainly down in Kansas, it probably will be. Nebraska, with the early season warmth and drying some things out, it probably will be a little earlier than usual. So far, there doesn't seem to be concern about irrigation availability. We talked about that a little bit on our call yesterday and seemed that there would be enough in the Platte and other systems to supply what is needed.
Okay. Another question about change to the potential high Missouri River runoff from the snowpack combined with the high river flows in Montana. So most of the peaks, and Kevin Lau, you can speak up if you'd like to, or raise your hand or whatever, and I'll try to turn on your speaker if you want to comment after I screw this up. But anyway, most of the peaks in Montana in terms of the tributary runoffs the tributaries have reached their peaks, and so now the reservoirs, the major reservoirs are okay in terms of holding or handling, if you will, that runoff. There will be substantial above normal, I think, flows in the river for some time as that floodwater gets evened out over the seasons. So over the summer and into the fall, and that's sort of the normal course in terms of the handling of the Missouri. But there's no indication of major issues on the Missouri River. Now, in the lower part of the basin where you get those big convective storms, sometimes you can always have tributary flooding that happens from time to time. Oh, okay, Kevin's going to fix, Kevin from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, I think, if I can turn on his speaker, is going to add a couple sentences to that. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So you are partially correct. We've probably seen our peak flows out of the Milk Basin, the Milk River Basin. We had some major flooding, major crest the very last week of April. However, we are just on the cusp of seeing the big show in the Yellowstone and the Upper Missouri. But when I say big show, I mean the crest for this season. So, but nothing to really write home about. We did have one location on the Muscle Shell, which is a tributary to the Missouri above Fort Peck. The Muscle Shell actually went to major a few days ago at one location. That was a combination rainfall and mid-level snowmelt. But so here's the latest on what we're expecting as far as flooding. So in the Yellowstone Basin, we're still expecting the Wind River and the Clarks Fork Yellowstone to both reach minor flood, and that'd be sometime around first part of June. In the upper Missouri, we're expecting the, well, we actually have the Sun River. The Sun River is actually in minor flood now. We're expecting the Big Hole River to go into minor next week. The Jefferson River possibly could go into moderate at the end of this month, and the Missouri River at Towson maybe minor in June. So a handful of places, primarily or predominantly minor in as far as significance goes. So, but we do have a handful of places that probably will reach minor flooding.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm glad you chimed in there. Hey, Kevin, can you just say a few more words about potential flooding in the Missouri, your entire basin, just the usual statement?
Sure. For the most part, I would say that we have a below average or statistically a below average chance for flooding at most locations, simply because of the dry conditions. It's unbelievable to me, but we had absolutely no flooding in eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri in April. So we will have what I call episodic, on again, off again, thunderstorm driven flooding in southern Iowa, Missouri, eastern Kansas, but you know, nothing out of the ordinary, and probably less than ordinary. So,
all right. Thank you, Kevin. All right. Any other questions, or I'm going to put your hand down for a minute. Anybody else want to raise their hand, ask a question, or have a comment? Okay. I see, Matt, you sent me some stuff. I would share it, but it hasn't come through on my email, so I don't see it. It may be a big picture or something. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Doug, to follow up on what Kevin said, the National Weather Service does have Streamflow maps on current conditions and forecast conditions on their website. So if you want to look at current conditions and see where things are and how they're projected to be, you can use that website too.
All right. Yeah, water.weather.gov, according to Mr. Lau. Thank you, Kevin. And I think on that note, unless there's any other comments, we're going to hang it up, and we'll see you again next month from Nebraska City. There will be a number of us in Nebraska City at something called the American Association of State Climatologists meeting, which is an annual event. But we'll be working with Aaron from Ohio State, and he's going to be doing the presentation there. Hopefully everything works. So, you know, cross your fingers for us. And we will see you next month. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dennis.